everyone. I'm Claire Chan with the Georgia Municipal Association, and welcome to Grants 101 for Georgia's local officials. This is a 12-part webinar series. We're on number 11, and this series is brought to you by GMA as well as the Georgia Association of Regional Commissions. So we have a great discussion set up for you today, and without further ado, I want to go ahead and turn things over to your experts, Amanda Day and Kimberly Hayes Denuga of Payday Services. Take it away, Amanda and Kimberly.
Well, thank you so much. Amanda is sharing her screen, and we're just going to hop right into this. I feel like we've built a little community over these last 11. It's hard to believe that we just have one more to go, but we are definitely saving the best for last. And by that, I mean the stuff that people rarely want to talk about, but it is super important and is actually harder than grant writing. And that is grant management and getting it right. This is going to be an overview, in 58 minutes or 57 minutes, we're going to rocket through a lot of things. We don't pretend to say that this is going to be an all-around comprehensive guide. And we're going to be talking about a lot of things related to uniform guidance, and that's sort of the official compendium of all things related to all sorts of grants and grant management topics, particularly grant management topics. And we'll reference this, and I bet if we ask Amanda nicely enough, she'll put a link to how to get to the uniform guidance to CFR Part 200, your friend and pal in the grant management journey. So without further ado, we'll hop into telling you a little bit about us. This is what we look like when we're standing up. And we have been doing this for a really long time. We love connecting people with good information that can help you do more wonderful things in your community through grants, funding, fundraising, etc. There's a lot of information out there. Most of it's really good. Some of it's a little sus, and we want to help you weed through to get to the good stuff. And we also don't believe that learning has to be boring. So that's who we are, and let's hop on in. We've got a couple of house rules. If you've been to other webinars and the live versions, again, as Claire mentioned, these are available. The recordings are available. The PDFs are available. The resource guides are all available through GMA and will be available for you to go back and look at or to refer to folks. They've even been so kind as to post it on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, you can access this information or share it. So that's what we're all about. We've already connected a great deal and learned a lot about older caffeinated beverages in the chat today before we got started. So that's a great way to connect and make comments. If you have specific questions, because I know there might be some detailed questions about grant management, please use the Q&A feature that's down on that sort of ruler, that line of options that you can use in Zoom. And also when you're using the chat, make sure you change that blue bar from just the panelists to everyone. So the little blue button should say everyone, and there's a little arrow to help you get to that. And this is being recorded, and we are ready to jump into the fun and the fame of the grant management game. So here's the deal. We want you to help you keep the grants you've already won, because it's so much easier to manage the grants you've got than to stop managing those grants and try to get new grants. Same principles, fundraising. It's so much easier to keep the donors you already have than to always be on the hunt all the time for brand new donors because you're not treating the donors right that you do have. Grant management and grant writing are so intrinsically tied together. And as you are developing your grant strategy, also develop a grants management strategy, right? Because sometimes it's not the same person who writes the grants that manages the grants. Because sometimes if you're tasked with writing a lot of grants, you can't be the person that also manages all the grants. Or if you're managing a ton of grants, as Amanda will tell you later, that's not the good time to go after 5 more federal grants if you're already managing 10 or 12 or 20. But again, we want to break down sort of the basics in this. We want to guide you through the process, and want to keep you out of jail and keep you that money from being clawed back. I mean, I'm kind of joking about the jail thing, but am I though?
It has happened.
Basically, what you're doing, I know it sounds so easy, right? Oh, just 5 simple steps. Just keep track of everything. Just do all your reimbursement requests on time. roll with the changes. If your funding agency changes how they want to see reimbursements, ask me how to know. Track all your program evaluation outcomes. Make sure everything's going according to plan. If it's not going according to plan, figure it out and fix it. Then do all your reporting ahead of time or on deadline, and then make sure you close out the grant properly, right? Just 5 little things. You can just knock those off over lunch, maybe. Of course, I'm joking, but these really are the steps. And I really, keeping track of it all is probably just the overarching goal of, and if you are the grant manager, just like grant writing, it is not a solo sport. You may be more of a project manager of the grant, right? Because you're going to need information from the program or project or department that's purchasing the equipment. You're going to need information from finance. You're going to probably be the main person reaching out to the federal or state agency that's provided the grant for you. And so if this just sounds untenable, it's really about regular check-ins. All 5 things on this list are just related to building a system that works for you for your regular check-ins, and then taking action when things go a little bit off the path. So again, tracking it, staying on top of reimbursement requests, and the little ask me how I know. I'm working with a client, and there was a little hiccup in some transition and some of their leadership, but there was also a bigger hiccup at the state agency. It's not a Georgia agency, it's in another state, and they changed how things had to be coded for proper reimbursement. So 2 things happened, and this agency is now having to go back to September to get reimbursed for costs and for activities and including completed from September to now. And they're doing it, and they're going to be okay. But it's just, things can go a little bit off, and then all of a sudden you're not getting those reimbursements on time because something has changed, or more than one thing has changed. And we'll get into details about how to handle when your program or project isn't being implemented according to plan, or when bigger things pop up, and how do you handle those as a part of the reporting process. And then Amanda's going to wrap it up with closeout, because believe it or not, even when you have closed out the grant, and I'm speaking of federal and state, it ain't closed out till they say it's closed out. And that is the name of that term.
Yeah.
So hopping on into, Amanda, I think this might be yours.
No, it's you.
Then I'm going to do it. Keeping
My
track. I made a little note to myself. That's not my usual note, and I threw myself off. So let's go. Keeping track of it all. Listen, one of the biggest things that I learned in managing grants was, this is going back to, and there's still some private funders that do send checks, okay? And there's some government agencies that do send checks, but a few years ago, when that was even more prevalent, when there wasn't nearly as much electronic fund transfer kind of thing going on, I learned that I needed to hop in the ED's office, get real friendly with the executive assistant, and go through his mail, because there would be grant agreements and checks sitting on his desk. And he was just a busy guy. He was the externally facing face of the agency, and he needed to be out and about. But it was always, I was like, I need that. I need the big fat envelope with the grant agreement and the check. I'm going to open it in front of you, kindly research executive assistant, and we're going to start signing this and get this into play. And another big thing to do would be to go ahead and calendar out all the reporting requirements and any other deadlines that need to come up. Yes, celebrate. Yes, wave the check around. Maybe they give you one of those big checks. That's super old fashioned. People still do that. Those phone cord checks where you have to do the grip and grin and take the picture. Whatever it takes, celebrate, but jump on the grant management there. Technically, you should already know what, if you've applied for that grant, who will be managing it in your organization, what people are going to be on tap for that. And then you want to set up ways, meetings, deadlines to start tracking this. Please don't leave this. Please don't just celebrate and sign and move on with your life, because even if people really need that money to do good things in the community, they're doing a lot of other things in their job and they may not even realize how fast you need to jump on the grant. I would also say when you're looking at that grant agreement before you sign it, you may get something lovely where you're like, you asked for $1 million for this program and you made a great case and you did all the good things and but they awarded you $750,000. That's a great time before you sign the agreement to go back and say, thank you so much for this grant. This means we can take this, but it changes the scope of our project, right? Maybe we're serving fewer people, or we're not getting, the same number of cruisers that we had allocated in this budget because we're getting less money. It's okay to do that and work with your funder to make sure that it's in writing and people feel good about that, because that's a really common occurrence. And if you haven't already, if this is a reimbursement grant, remember, as I said earlier, sometimes things can go awry and then your funding stream kind of gets cut off. If they're sending you the big check, which is usually like private funding, let's celebrate. But if it's a reimbursement or a drawdown, let's understand from the get-go exactly how that works, when you can submit, what the stuff needs to look like to get that money going. Because here's a shocker, they're not going to work as fast as you want them to. That's just not how this process works. Also, right after that grant award is announced, however you are managing your files in whatever system, it could be you're using Microsoft Teams. You could be storing things in Google Drive. Probably not if you're a government agency, but maybe you might be using Dropbox, or you have a specific in-house system. Whatever it is you're using, go ahead and set up a folder with that grant, named for that grant, and then put in all the different deliverables underneath that, even if they're empty folders for now. But make sure that you're including a copy of the proposal, right? Copy of the grant agreement and any other documentation. And then go ahead and set up those reporting folders and calendar it out to get going. And I think this is Amanda's slide, and she's right, Doctor. That is what you're gonna have to do. That is what you're gonna have to do. So as we scoot on to thinking about who's going to do what, I get it. If you're in a small municipality, you may be doing all these things, but just know that if you're not doing them, someone else needs to do them because they must be done. So this is a great opportunity, a great slide to share with someone who you may report to explain all the different parts and pieces of this. If you're in a larger agency, and you've handled many state and federal grants before, you may already have a good working system. So just treat this as a review. You're going to need to collect signatures, set up grant accounts, purchasing, reporting, reimbursement requests, site visits. We'll get to that. And we also, in our final in this series with y'all, we're going to walk you through how to survive an audit. So big details on that are coming up. But also you'll need to complete the project and close out the grant, and then prepare for just the regularly scheduled audits that you would undergo for grants of a certain size. So we already know, we've talked twice now about those steps. Now let's look at who might be responsible. It's been my experience, and I would love to have Amanda chime in on this, that generally the grants administrator, who may or may not be the grant writer, really functions as the project manager for the grant. Mm-hmm. And if that is you, it would be great if other people were hopping in and doing that, but you just can't count on that. This grant, if no one owns it, then it's going to be really hard to manage and it will go off the rails pretty quickly. So usually there's a grant manager or grant administrator that would do those things like collect the signatures, complete and submit the reports with input from program and finance, right? And depending on how large your municipality is, you may have a separate person in finance. Maybe it's on a staff accountant or the finance director who actually submits the reimbursement requests and tracks the payments. But as the grant manager, it's really a wise move to make sure that you're included in all of those things, because the grant administrator could leave, they could get promoted, they could move out of state. And you, as the grant manager, would need to hop in and make things happen. Generally, you'll get notice from the agency, the funding agency, in preparation for a site visit. And it's always great to prep in advance the folks who will be participating. Generally, it is the grant manager or administrator, as we've worded it here, the person sort of in charge of the programmatic elements, and then a representative from your finance office. And then depending on the size and scope of the grant, you may want to have senior leadership at least participate in part of that, or at least acknowledge, particularly if it's on site, that it's happening. When it comes to project and grant closeout, that's generally the program manager, the grants administrator, and in larger agencies, their peer in the finance department, because everybody's got to come together to close it out. So it's outcomes, it's money. They all have to come together, and you as the grant manager or administrator can be the person that the point person to make this happen. Again, not that you have to do all the work, but here's all the work that has to be done, and you may be bird dogging it to make sure that it happens. And oh, I'm sorry, Amanda, did you want to hop in and say something?
Well, and I was just gonna say too, like you definitely, I put it in the chat, but you definitely want to figure this out before you get the grant, because otherwise everybody's just gonna be like, well, you wrote it, you do it all. So figuring out who's responsible for what, it is definitely a team sport. And we even have a colleague and friend who, for each grant, before, like during the submission process, he's like, okay, if I'm gonna write this grant on your behalf, know that there's gonna be work on the back end. And he puts together almost like an MOU that says, okay, if we get this grant, program director John Smith, you're responsible for X, Y, and Z. Me, grants administrator, is responsible for this. You, finance person, are responsible, and everybody signs. So when it comes to it, when they're like, well, why do I have to do this report? Because we decided it was best, and here's the MOU. And I'm not saying you have to do that, but if it gets to where nobody's wanting to fulfill their role once the money shows up, you may want to have to create like a little bit of a grant management role and responsibility chart that everybody signs and agrees to.
Particularly if you have a larger team, or if your team is spread across many different departments, perhaps even located in different buildings. And even for smaller teams, it's also a wake-up call, I think, to folks who are like, well, you wrote the grant, as Amanda said, you can just turn all that stuff in and I go get us more money. It's like, no,
Yeah.
we don't do this the right way. We're not getting any more money. And I've had the direct conversations, I'll say, with program people or finance people. It's like, I've even had to say a couple of times, not often, but a couple of times, it's like, no, we're not getting more grants until you spend the ones you got, right?
Yep.
Because what part of getting grants is demonstrating need. And if you don't need this money, I'm not going to go out and work so hard to get this money. Then other departments will get it. It rarely comes to that, but you got to be prepared to just walk your talk on that, because it's the truth. So as we move on, again, in the interest of time, we've got a lot of great information to get out here. What are you tracking? Here's just some specific items. We could spend days talking about some of this stuff, right? But we want to give you an overview. That is what we're about here. So reports, you could be generating reports on program outcomes, right? Tracking your program monthly, quarterly, or every 6 months. Why can't I give you a firm answer? Because it differs from application to application, even within the same funding agency. Grants are funding a position, you got to have timesheets. And depending on the kind of HR system that you already may be using, you could add coding to it to help this, or it could be pen and paper. You know, it's whatever you're working with, but you got to do it and you've got to track it. And the program people have to buy into this and have to do it. So again, that project management. You'll need to track expenditures, right? So talking about program outcomes, now getting into the finance end of it. Receipts, invoices, bids, what kind of procurement process you're using. You need to use the same procurement process for state and federal grants that you do generally in your organization. It can be stricter than federal requirements, but it can't be less strict, and you must be consistent, right? Super important. In terms of data, getting back to the outcome programmatic side of things, tracking how you're reporting on your goals and specifically your objectives. And that should match what you said you do in the evaluation section. If you said you were going to have a series of town hall meetings about crime reduction in your municipality as a part of gathering information, you need to do that. And if you are, you know that because you're the project manager over this grant process, you may not be the one holding or scheduling the meetings, but you may be the one going, okay, y'all, we said we were going to do 4 of these. We need to start scheduling them and reporting on them. How will that look? Are we just recording? Are we able to use AI to transcribe the recordings? Is that going to be what we use? How is this going to work? And who's going to see these reports? How else are we going to get this information? Other super exciting, but very useful funder requirements. This is Amanda's favorite. I'm just going to name them out. And
You want me to give a quick recap of what they all are in case no one's heard of them before?
if you'd like, absolutely.
Sure. So again, the thing is, all of this stuff is going to be listed in your award agreement from your funder. If you're like, how do I know? It's all in there. So you want to read that document. And so these are some of the federal requirements that typically follow most projects. So Davis-Bacon Wage Act, if you have a construction project, you have to ensure that the contractors and subcontractors you're hired are being paid set wages. And so they have to turn in wage sheets and you have to check to make sure people are being paid. It's time intensive, but it's important. Buy American just means you have to make sure that the things you're purchasing are made in the good old US of A. You have to document to prove that. Disadvantaged business enterprise, you may have what's called a DBE goal, which they may say this again has to do with construction, but let's just say you have $1 million construction project. If you have a 10% DBE goal, that means 100% of them are $100,000, that 10% of your total budget would need to go towards a subcontractor who is a disadvantaged business enterprise, which it could mean women owned, minority owned. There's a couple other definitions for that. So when you're looking for your contractor, you're making sure that they're hiring a sub who meets that definition of a DBE and they're giving them at least 10% of the work of the project, right? Some funders, if you're doing hiring, you may have to give preference to veterans. So that's something you want to know. The Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, which is FFATA for short. FFATA, good times. That basically is just an extra report you'll have to do, which if you get money directly from the feds and then your agency gives subawards that to other agencies, then you would have to do some reporting to let the funder know who you submitted that to. I'm guessing Patrick at the regional authority, I bet y'all probably have to do FFATA reporting. Suspended and debarment checks for contractors. You're basically just making sure you're not hiring a contractor who's on the naughty list for the feds. So that's something you'd have to check for. Sometimes certain services can only be provided to certain clients, like maybe it's only for seniors. They have to be 65 and older, whatever it is. So you want to make sure you're doing that. There could be more. There's lots more, but those are some of the main ones you may see when it comes to federal grants. So we could teach a whole class just on those alone and never cover all the stuff. So, let's talk about how funders will pay you. There are a handful out there that do pay you up front. Like Kimberly said, especially smaller foundation grants, they tend to just, you've got $5,000, here's your check, happy spending, right? It happens occasionally with the feds, but not a whole lot. Typically, they either do drawdowns or reimbursement requests. So reimbursement requests, that's probably the most common. And, they'll tell you up front, hey, you've been awarded X amount of dollars. You spend the money up front and you seek reimbursement. And usually they'll let you seek reimbursement on a monthly basis. So, if I spent $10,000 this month, I'm going to collect all my receipts and documentation. I'm going to turn that back into the funder, asking them to pay. If it's 100% grant, they pay all of it. If it's a 50-50 grant, they'd pay 50% of the cost or however that works, right? So it's just every month you'll going through and seeking reimbursement. Drawdowns are when they allow you to draw down money as needed. They're not always super clear about what that means, but if you get $1 million award, they're not just going to let you draw down the full $1 million and put it in your bank account and hang on to it if you've got 3 years to spend it. Typically, what they do is things like, if I've got a big expense coming up, like I'm about to order this piece of equipment, it's $100,000. I could probably go ahead and draw down that $100,000 because I'm about to buy this piece of equipment. So you're kind of drawing down in anticipation of upcoming expenses, if that makes sense. Okay. Like I said, most common is reimbursement, and typically they're going to require some paperwork to prove that you spent the money the correct way and on the correct things. They're going to want invoices that show exactly what you have purchased. Okay. And then they usually want backup documentations. In addition to those rather, they may want you to submit an invoice saying, hey, this is all the money I've spent. What you do to prove you spent the money, you're going to have receipts, you're going to have invoices. They may want to see a copy of the cleared check so they know that you actually did pay them, because clearly once upon a time somebody turned in invoices, got paid for it, but really never paid their vendor for the stuff, right? So thanks to them, we all have extra work to do. You may also have to turn in documentation to show you followed your procurement policies. Kimberly mentioned that's how important it is to either have policies that are equal to or stricter than the federal guidelines. And so if your procurement policy says anything over $10,000, you have to get 3 quotes, you may have to turn to show, hey, here are my 3 quotes, to show that you went through that process, right? So from funder to funder, oftentimes you're uploading this documentation to an online portal, but sometimes, especially with some state agencies, sometimes you're still mailing these things or emailing them in. So, and I will tell you from experience, people are going to say, hey, this is a grant. I don't have to follow procurement. Grants are special. We have to do different things. And my answer is you are right. Grants are so special that if we don't follow procurement, we get in big time trouble. So if you make a mistake and don't follow procurement with your own city's money, you might get a slapper on the wrist from your finance department. You do it with the feds, there's going to be a little more consequences than that. So yes, grants are special, so special. We really have to follow the rules. We have to dot every I, cross every T. So just don't be surprised if you have to remind people, because I don't know how many times someone will go out and buy something and I'm like, where's our 3 bids? Or where's our 3 quotes? Or where's, who signed off on this? And they're like, oh, it's a grant. We can do whatever. No, you can't. Go, Kimberly.
I am typing away
Typing.
that I'm putting in, oh, I put in the wrong link. I'll tell you what, Amanda, I'm gonna hop on the slide. I wanted to put in the link again to the CFR. And instead of doing that, I would love for you to do that, because the reason I want to put it in again is because this is an overview. There's no way we can hit every single element. And we want you to have access to the actual federal guide that you can have online or download and just refer to that. We're giving you the overview. The devil is in the details, and it is in that guide. So hopping back from reimbursement over to project implementation, again, thinking about reporting on programmatic or project outcomes, right? Here's some good questions to ask as the grant administrator to the program, people on a regular basis, perhaps in a monthly meeting. If it's a big old federal grant or state grant, might be good to check in regularly and not just the day before the report is due. So you want to know, are you serving the right number of people? Are people showing up? Are you reaching the folks you said you were going to reach with this? Are the activities that you built into the grant proposal, either in the program description or the logic model or both, are they going on? Is it actually happening? Are there specific milestones, hiring deadlines, training deadlines, ordering equipment? Is the thing that you really need backlogged for another 6 months? That was a big problem a couple of years ago. In terms of your objectives, are you either on track to meet them, or if you're not on track, can we understand what's happening? Is it related to some of the things at the top of this list? Like you're doing a series of classes, or you're doing a series of community events and the weather's been terrible and no one has attended, or the materials and supplies are on back order, so you can't distribute some training equipment that you might need to distribute. Are you collecting the right data to make sure that you're meeting your objectives? Technically, this should have already been addressed in the grant writing process. But if your measurements that you thought were existing are not working, or maybe the person who said they would work is no longer there and is replaced by another person, you got to circle back and make sure that that documentation is happening. Also, a part of this is, what's going right and what's going wrong. I can't remember when a funder has only wanted to know and reports everything that's going right, because funders at the end, they're just people too. And we all know best laid plans. We all know how that goes. There's always going to be a hiccup or a glitch or perhaps something larger. And it is better to document it and come up with a plan to resolve it than to try and just brush it under the rug or off in the corner and hope that no one knows. It's just, it'll catch up to you in ways that could endanger current or future funding. And it's just not ethical practice. Also, it's important to pay attention to your quantitative data, the numbers of people served, the numbers of incidents reported, all those things. That is important. But if you're not asking the key participants in the program or the team or partner agencies how it's going or why things aren't quite on track or what can we do to make this program better, you're going to miss out on a lot of things. And you may identify a barrier to either participation or compliance, which you didn't even know was there. And you won't get that information by strictly focusing on quantitative data all the time. You need to mix it up and ask some open-ended questions. So I'm always eye on the clock. We're moving through to talk a little bit in the next slide about what can happen when you don't do it right. The little rope is frayed and there's just, that's my last nerve. That's what my last nerve looks like when I'm trying to herd cats for a really specific grant management project. That's why I don't do a ton of grant management anymore. I prefer training and other aspects of the grants process. But what can happen when you don't have those meetings and you don't check in or someone's pressuring you to not report on some poorer outcomes? We just wanted to give a laundry list of examples of things. Number one is misusing funds. And I mean, I hate to say it, but we've all read the news reports, right? A lot of times poor grant management is more down to not understanding how it works. But there are plenty of examples of folks who have taken the money, COVID relief funding, a big example. A lot of money went out really fast. A lot of lack of clarity about reporting, a lot of things. A lot of people pocketed that money. I mean, in Georgia, I don't want to particularly call out, but a city not too far from where I'm sitting today. And I think people are serving jail time because of that. It's just, but really another more common example of poor grant management is further on down the list, not spending the money in a timely manner. So you got people that are pocketing it and buying condos or buying ponies or whatever it is they're going to buy. But then a lot of the time, poor grant management is you're just not getting reimbursed on time because the money, the programmatic piece isn't happening, or it's happening, but maybe the invoices are not coded in a way that your finance department understands to link to that grant. So no one's trying to do anything wrong. It's a failure to communicate. Also, poor grant management, particularly for reimbursement funding, is like spending the money before the date of the grant actually starts. And you may think, you are being so nitpicky. And I'm like, yes, I am. I am that way because a grant cycle starts when the funder says it starts, not when you get notification. Sometimes you're like, you get the, hey, here's your award packet to download and sign and get back to us for the grant. You may get that in June and the grant may start in July. Don't be submitting stuff that went down in June and expect to get reimbursed for it. That's not the way grants work. And again, as the project manager, you need to be the grant manager, the grant administrator needs to be like the subject matter expert on that grant. Another example of poor grant management, not meeting the objectives, not just maybe we predicted 80% of folks would do X or Y and maybe 75, but like 10%. We're like within 10% compliance. I've never had a funder claw back money for not meeting objectives as long as there was a clear communication about what was going wrong and what the plan was to address it. The clawbacks and the sort of informal or formal blacklisting occurs when you just don't report, you're not meeting it, and you don't have any plans. Clearly, as I said earlier, if someone is straight up stealing and violating grant terms, that's an example of poor grant management, and it's also a very strong case for not having the same person write the grant, manage the program outcomes, and handle all the finances. It's just a recipe for things going a little bit without those checks and balances. You're setting yourself up for some potential failure in grant management. Obviously, if you're not completing those grant activities that you outlined, again, or not having a plan to either catch up or change the activities and have that discussion with the funder about how that works, not great grant management. No documentation or not communicating regularly, also red flags for your funding agency that stuff is going wrong and you may not be able to handle the grant that they're doing. So next up, we're going to delve into the wonderful world of reporting and how that can keep you from those poor grant management practices.
This is you too, unless you want me to take it.
No, my screen, I think our power just went doo-doo, but it's back on now. My screen is funny. Sorry, y'all, we're just having some pop-up storms over here. So for reporting, figure it out early. Like I said, have the big celebration. Put that mess on your calendar now so that you understand when they're due. And don't just put the deadline. If you are the person that is going to be submitting the report, you need to tell yourself, how is this, back it up? How much time do I need to get the information out of busy people who are well-meaning, but may not want to give me they may not feel that my emergency is their priority. That's just life. Again, your grant award agreement, please make sure you have a copy of that in a very easily accessible location. I know that Amanda for years worked out of giant binders.
I
And
love
it worked for her. I am more of a paperless kind of gal, except today when I'm like, oh, is the power going to go out? That's not a fun feeling when I'm trying to access documents. But you need to be, again, the subject matter expert on when the report's going in, what kind of information, who is going to give you that information, and how long is it going to take you to get that information out of that person. Straight up, I want to say, program folks are out there in the community making stuff happen, doing their jobs. They may want that grant with all their heart and soul, but unless someone is gently leading them along the path to reporting compliance, they may not make it a priority. And they're not bad people, they're busy people. And knowing ahead of time, maybe you don't need that formal signed agreement like our friend Danny did, but then again, it worked for him. Some sort of reminder. You'll need to be that person. Even if the people you're asking for information from sort of outrank you in terms of the organizational hierarchy, you're the one that keeps the money flowing freely by writing and managing the grants. And it's time to assert your importance in the process and remind them that without these reports coming on time, it's going to be hard to keep that money coming. It's going to be even harder to get new money. A quick rundown, again, in the interest of time, on the types of reports, and that will be coming up in our next slide. And I really want you to treat this slide, if you would, as a reference. Again, Amanda's put in twice. All of these things are outlined and explored actually in great detail in the CFR, which is the Federal Grant Management Guidebook, which also holds for states using federal pass-through money to do, then the state agency might be granting it to you. They're held to those same federal requirements. So are you. If you in turn are giving grants to sub-recipients out of the larger bucket of grant funding, they too, everybody's got to follow the federal grant management rules and regs, okay? So just a brief intro or a brief review, depending on your experience, to the types of reports. Lots of numbers and acronyms and dashes because government. So progress reports are commonly referred to as PPRs, and they're a standard form, which is why the SF is in front with a little hyphen. So the narrative is usually going to need to take place on an SF PPR. Some other standard financial reporting documents. And again, even if you're not the one who is putting together the information required for the SF 425 or the SF 425A, if you're doing the narrative and the finances do kind of need to match up, right? If you're saying in the narrative, oh, well, we've reached 1,000 people and we've installed 1 million smoke detectors, or we have, and then on the finances, y'all only spent $20,000 out of $1 million grant, there will be questions and concerns. So even if you're not the person putting the numbers together, the numbers and the narrative need to match. Another commonly used form, if you are able to do like more of a drawdown kind of situation versus strictly reimbursement, is the SF-270, an advanced payment request. And if that is not like an ATM get out of jail free card, you again have to fill out the form. You have to do what you say you're going to do, and you have to have that documentation. We mentioned FAFATA. It's a happy acronym before. And if you have those sub-recipients that I mentioned, you have to do an additional set of reports, regular reports to fsrs.gov as a part of your regular reporting process. And the failure to do that, again, not only is it poor grant management, it can endanger reimbursement. It can mean either, if not disbarment, certainly your agency can be placed at a higher risk, making it more difficult for you to get future funding. And if you, particularly if you are working with BIL funding, bipartisan infrastructure law, or Inflation Recovery Act funding, but particularly BIL, you may also have to do disadvantaged business enterprise, or DBE, monthly reports as a part of showing that you're addressing with this grant at least 40% of the population from disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged businesses.
Oh no, this is the one. This is actually if you had a DBE goal and had to make sure one of your subcontractors are DBE. So this is showing that you actually are spending that percentage of your thing towards a subcontractor that is a DBE. So it's different than the
Right.
goals. They like to use some of the same language.
Lots of forms, lots of confusion.
Yes.
Thank you, Amanda. And
You're
finally, we mentioned Davis-Bacon Wage Act monthly wage sheets. What a joy, but essential, particularly for construction funding, to make sure that everyone is employed doing what they said they were supposed to be hired to do at a fair market wage.
I will say, if you find yourself managing a federal grant that has to do with construction and you're having to oversee Davis-Bacon, I highly recommend. I took years ago, HUD has a big office in Atlanta, and they teach a week-long, like 40-hour class on managing Davis-Bacon. It's free. And I think a lot of times the Georgia Department of Transportation may occasionally do trainings on DBE as well. So if you suddenly are like, hey, I've got to do this, and I remember Amanda and Kimberly said something about it, check out and see if HUD or GDOT is offering any trainings, because it's one of those things, like I said, I took a 40-hour class and I still had questions all the time because it was a process. It was a thing.
A good point. So wrapping up this section, really just being clear about what's happening and what's not happening, clear communication, reaching out ahead of the reporting time if something is going off the rails, is really just being honest, direct, and straightforward is always going to be the best policy around grant management. And I think just really in general.
Yep.
There we go. Now we're moving on to closeout, and that is Amanda Day's specialty.
Closing the session today with closeout conversation. So once you finish your project, you've come to the end, you've done all the things you promised you were going to do, you served all the people, your grant period's running out. There's usually going to be a lot of final things. Funders usually like that final narrative report where you kind of summarize what's happened over the course of the 1, 3, 5 years, however long your project's been, right? There's usually a final reimbursement request. And a lot of times they'll have a little checkbox where they want you to mark that it was final. There's typically, just final on all the reportings. And there may be some additional reports you've never done that they want you to do at the end. If you've done any construction, they may want final copies of blueprints of things. It's just the funder's going to communicate with you what all you need. And what I often do as I'm getting near the end is I typically email my project director and say, hey, we're about to wrap up. I'm guessing we have about a month's worth left of work left. I would like to go ahead and start planning. What all do you need for closeout? And because I like to start working on that laundry list, whatever it is. And they, making sure you've shown every invoice for every penny you've spent, and just making sure if there's anything you've missed, this is a time to start turning things in if you're behind on it, and making sure your files are all together. Because just because the grant's over doesn't mean everything's completely done, which we'll talk about that as part of this closeout session. But it's kind of that last hurrah of getting all the documentation together. So you've got your copies and you've submitted everything to the funder. Now, it can be very easy to assume like, hey, I finished my grant. I spent all my money. They've paid me back. I've submitted all my final things. We're done. Yay. Woohoo. Technically, a grant is not closed until the funder tells you it's closed. So you can submit everything to them and they can still continue to come back with questions. Okay. So what you need from your funder is a closeout letter, which they can email it to you. It could be an email, it could be an actual letter they mail you, but you need something in writing from your funder that says this grant is officially closed. And that's usually the last paper. When I did my binder grant management back in the day, that was the final piece of paper I was going to put in that binder. And it's important because now that it's closed, the funder is not going to come back to you for more documents. And that starts the clock for your retention schedule, right? So there's federal rules about retention. And so retention of all your files and your records, the Office of Management and Budget, which they're the ones who wrote that 2 CFR Part 200 that we all have to live by with federal grant management rules. Their general rule is 3 years of retention. So if I had a funder close out my grant today, January 25th, 2024, for 3 years, I have to keep all of those records. Okay. Now, once those 3 years are up, I can and should dispose of those files. Some funders have a longer retention record. So again, it goes back to reading your award agreement to know if it's maybe 5 years or 7 years. So whatever that agency's policy is, they can always make things stricter, right? So when it comes to the rules of everything, OMB, that's kind of like the federal regulation, but then the funder, that whatever department at the federal level, they can make things stricter. And then your agency could make it even stricter, right? So OMB could say it's 5 years. You can have a grant from the Department of Justice. If they say they want you to keep it for 5 years, or OMB says 3 years, Department of Justice could say 5 years. Your own agency's retention policy may say grants have to be kept for 7 years. You have to keep it for whatever is the strictest. So in that case, the longest. So make sure you understand what all the numbers are, and whichever one's the longest, that's how long you're going to keep it. Now, when it is time to destroy your records, I encourage you to do so. And I will tell you from experience, I had a hard time letting my binders go after retention was over because, I worked real hard and a lot of love and heart, and those are like my babies. And so like I'd sent everything off to offsite storage and I left them there and I never touched them because I don't know. I don't know what I was worried about, but we got a new city clerk one day and she came in and she's like, Amanda, your storage is out of control. And I was like, okay, do I need to write a grant for more? Like, what's going on? And she's like, no, you've got stuff that just needs to go. And of course I was like, yeah, but what if I need it? No. And she's like, have you ever pulled your files from storage? And of course the answer was no. And she's like, if anybody came in today and wanted to see a grant from 2002, if we have it on file, we have to show it to them. And what if they find something, a mistake that was made? We're in trouble, right? But she's like, but if retention's done and we can destroy it, then if they come and ask for it, we can say, sorry, that's outside of the scope of our retention schedule. It's gone. So she made a believer of me of when it's time to get rid of it, it's time to get rid of it. Okay. So I'm encouraging you to do the same thing here. And I will, since we've got a few minutes, I will tell you my one horror story about closing out a grant. I had a grant that I had submitted all of my paperwork. Great, things are fine. And it was one of those projects that like it had delay after delay. It was a signal timing project. It should have taken like 4 years. I think it took 7. Needless to say, I was ready to close it out. So I sent everything to the guy. I've been working with the same guy, Steve, forever. I'm like, Steve, let's get this sucker closed. I don't ever want to hear anything about this grant ever again. And he's like, right there with you. I'm a little busy this month, but I promise we'll get to it. Months go by. Steve and I keep emailing and he keeps saying, sorry. Now a whole year has gone after from all my final documents. I get an email from somebody. Dear Amanda, this is John. I'm your new project director. I would really appreciate it if you could send all your closeout documentation to me. Yeah. Hey, I emailed that to Steve a year ago. Yeah, Steve got promoted. I'm taking over. I can't find the files. Can you resend? Well, of course I have them. So I'm like, sure, here they are. Would really love it if you could send them. Yep, sure, no problem. A year goes by. Dear Amanda, this is Adam. I'm your new project director. Can you please send all your closeout documentation to Hey, send it to Steve. Then I send it to John. Here you go now. I don't work for that city anymore. For all I know, that grant is still open because I don't know what happened. And again, as long as it's open, if something is found, they could come back and go, hey, you didn't turn in this report. If that was 15 years ago, who's going to know how to find and do? So it just can become a nightmare. So I highly encourage you. And that's unusual. Usually funders are much more on top of it, but that was my lesson of, I can't, like, if I don't hear from a funder in a month or two, I'm going, hey, what's going on? What can I do to get this closed out? So highly recommend you work on that. And I have had a funder once come back at the end of a project. This is one of the first grants I ever managed. And my assumption was, if I turn in a reimbursement request and a funder pays me, surely they wouldn't pay me if I had any outstanding reports or things that I owed them. I just assumed they wouldn't do that, right? Wrong. The funder was going, yep, you submit, you turned in the money the right way, you spent it the right way, sure, we'll pay you. I had 3 years worth of DBE reports because I didn't know that was a thing. A grant. Now, fortunately, we had a DBE. We did meet the DBE goal, but I just didn't have, there was a monthly report that you had to submit that showed who was your DBE, how much money you paid them that month, and a copy of the check. Now, we didn't pay them, the contractor paid them. So God bless this. I called the contractor, got a hold of like their office manager. She took pity on me and offered to track down, because it had been several years, all the copies of the checks that they paid that contractor on that job. So I was able to recreate all the reports and I had those checks. So thankfully it was all fine. We turned it in and we moved on. But that was a good lesson for me of, just because they're paying you doesn't mean everything is going along. So if you're new at grant management, do not be afraid. I do this now all the time. I'll call them up like after our first couple of months. Hey, are you getting everything from us? Are we missing anything? Because I'd rather figure it out now than have to go back 3 years and figure all of that stuff out, right? So
It's
there's just fun stories. Grant management, it all goes awry. I'm just telling you. So
I guess the take home for me in hearing these horror stories is also, you can't assume that the agency itself is on top of everything all the time, even though you need to get everything right and get it all in. I mean, they're just humans involved and they have turnover and labor shortages, and it can just be a mess sometimes, but staying on top of it, not, so the no news is not necessarily good news, is my take on it.
Well, and I learned too, because I usually, when I get a grant award, I usually pick up the phone and introduce myself to the program person, just hey, Hugh, this is me. Because I know at some point I'm going to be calling needing help, or I've messed something up. So I like our first phone call to be, nice and calm. But I also try to stay on top of submitting everything early and often, checking in with them. And I'll, because, and then I've had funders that have been proactive in reaching out going, hey, Amanda, I just got this documentation. You're missing something. And I said something to someone once. I'm like, you are so great about being proactive. And I said, not all my funders are like that. And he was like, oh, I don't do this for everybody. He's like, you're nice and helpful, so I'll help you out too. And it's human nature, right? So I've learned, I'm really kind to my program people. I try to make life as easy as possible for them because I want them to look out for me too. And most of them don't have time to do it because they're busy. So if they are going to help someone, I'm going to make sure it's me they're helping. If I can be kind, and that does the job. Yeah.
See, y'all, she seems all nice and everything, but yeah, she's out there to get it done. Don't let her fool you.
Oh, so no questions in the Q&A, but if you've got some stuff you want to throw in the chat as we're wrapping up our Q&A, and again, this was really fast, down and dirty. You could easily take weeks and weeks of grant management training. It's a lot of stuff, but we do have several podcast episodes about it. So it's here. And we actually, Kimberly talks about horror stories. Almost every season, we have a kind of ripped from the headlines where we've pointed out where some agencies have gone awry with their grant management. I like to learn from the mistakes of others, so I don't do the same thing. So
they go awry on the local news or national news.
yes, those are the kinds of things we're sharing. So, it's like the grant management version of Law and Order. I love it. Of course, we've got a resource guide for you all as well, which Claire is sharing all the links where all the archives are, so you can find those there. That's where you can find us. And if you can believe it, I think Claire put it in the chat too, our last session with y'all is coming up in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about surviving an OIG audit, because I have lived through one and I'm still standing. So
Good to tell the tale.
yes. So, but if you got questions, throw them in the chat. We're here.
Claire, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just Another thank you to everyone on this call, to you, Amanda and Kimberly, for bringing us another great and informative session, and to everyone in the audience who's taken time to tune in and hear some words of wisdom from our two experts here. But yes, I did include in the chat a link to register for our last webinar, which is 2 weeks from today, same time, same place. If you ever encounter any issues with registering or anything regarding the webinar, you can email me or call me. I'm just going to drop my contact info in the chat. And of course, if you have any feedback about what you'd like GMA to potentially offer in the future when it comes to grants, send those our way as well. And we're always wanting to provide resources and events that are responsive to the needs of cities. And in this case, we know we've had county representatives and regional commission representatives on the call as well. So thank you, everyone, for all you do. I echo what Kimberly said here, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.